Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Public Utilities Commission's Broadband Caseworker Seminar Series. This is Broadband Technology 101. My name is Caleb Jones.
And I'm Karen Eckersley. The Broadband Caseworker team has created a series of webinars covering the business, technology, and the policy and funding context that communities need to provide broadband. Next slide, please. The yellow highlighted area on this slide shows how today's talk fits into the larger series. And the rest of the slide provides an overview of the entire seminar series. This is the first of 3 webinars on the technology of broadband. This technology series is designed to help communities understand the broadband technologies that are available and what technologies might best meet the needs of their community.
Our goal in this module is to provide an initial background on broadband technology, including how those technologies evolved over time, how broadband is delivered and measured, and how different technologies' capabilities compare to household and business needs. The agenda will cover the importance of broadband, the evolution of broadband and the internet, how broadband is delivered, broadband metrics, last mile broadband access options, how much speed users require, and we will finish each section with a discussion.
Let's first consider the internet and broadband in perspective by comparing to the other technologies that have connected us historically. What we see over time is that the world has become more connected as transportation and communication technologies improve, and that the communities that are better connected have prospered economically, have more options, and are more involved in what's happening in the world. For most of human history, communication and transportation were not meaningfully different technologies. Proximity to a coastline, a river, or a canal was what connected people and enabled them to trade. That really didn't change until the development of the telegraph and telephone lines in the 19th and 20th centuries for communication, and railroads and freeways in the 19th and 20th centuries for transportation. Like with the communication and transportation infrastructure of the 20th century, broadband infrastructure creates incredible opportunities for the communities that it connects. But it has left behind communities that do not have access to it. With railroads, certain inland communities gained unprecedented access to the benefits of global markets that used to be only available near ports. Other communities without railroad access sometimes lost population when people moved closer to the prosperity that the railroads enabled. We see a similar phenomenon with the development of the interstate highway system in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We're all familiar with the communities far from the highways that became kind of ghost towns when people relocated to better connected communities. How does that compare to communications technology? With the copper wire telephone network, we chose a model of universal service, just like we have for electricity. And that brought telephones and voice service to even the most remote parts of the country. The overall benefits for the United States have been enormous. In broadband communications, meanwhile, there is currently a pattern of metro areas being relatively well served and rural areas being less well served. But of course, there are also some neighborhoods in urban areas that are poorly served. A more equitable distribution of broadband can make all the difference today in how people are connected and participate in the economy. And you are part of the solution.
This slide shows just some of the different roles that broadband serves in a community. Each of these functions is improved by faster broadband service, and some of these functions can't be done at all below a certain level of service. For instance, with a low-speed internet connection, you may be able to check emails and access your bank account, but people won't be able to work remotely, parents can't make a virtual doctor's appointment, kids won't be able to participate in education, and a family definitely won't be able to do all of those things at the same time. So, when you hear people ask, what do you need all that bandwidth for, or why do you need more than a few megabits per second, keep in mind this long list of technologies that are only possible with more broadband.
Why is broadband critical? In addition to the workforce and economic development, we want to note that broadband is enabling exciting new technologies in lots of realms, such as transportation, agriculture, public health, and environmental monitoring. Digital literacy is key because it is increasingly difficult to apply for jobs or access services without going online. After a community gets access to broadband, it's important to make sure that all households are able to use it. There are many communities where broadband is available, but adoption is low because some people don't know how to connect or can't afford it reliably or can't afford the devices and equipment that they need. We'll cover this more later in later seminars.
Here are some numbers about why California is so important in the national conversation about the lack of internet. California has more unserved households than any state in the nation. More than half of Californians use broadband at the speed of 100 megabits per second, but that also means that about half do not. About half of rural households lack access to broadband service at 100 megabits per second, and about 30% of households on tribal lands lack access to broadband speeds at 100 megabits per second. These statistics do not consider the big factor of reliability. How often is the network available for use, and when is the signal degraded? What we want to have is fast, reliable, and affordable internet, for reasons that we're going to talk about further today.
We'll pause here so that you can discuss some questions among yourselves. What are the most important uses for broadband in your community? What opportunities do you think could be opened up by better access to broadband? What kinds of community groups are advocating for better broadband in your community? Healthcare, schools, businesses.
What do we mean when we say the internet? The origin story of the internet is universities and the military working together to create a system that would enable rapid communication across the network, even if individual locations on the network fail. That required infrastructure, the telephone network and fiber optics, and a software protocol that allowed computers to speak a common language, which was not something that they did before. What does the internet look like? Interestingly, it looks a lot like our highway system. Domestically, our major internet routes often follow highways, rail lines, pipelines, and other major infrastructure. The same communities that need to be connected by freeways and railroads to move people and goods also need to be connected by broadband to move information.
Let's look at what this looks like internationally. Here on this slide, we see a network of undersea connections that are represented by the colored lines on this slide. These lines represent high-capacity fiber optic cables resting on and buried in the bottom of the sea. You can see the density of these pipelines and also the possibilities for alternate routes for information to flow. Two major names in providing these international fiber routes are Global Crossing and Verizon. If you look at California specifically, our major cable landing points are San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and soon to be Eureka, and many places up and down the coast. These are called cable landings.
This slide shows the major long-haul fiber connection routes within the United States. These lines are owned by large communications providers. The big names are Lumen, Zayo, Crown Castle, Verizon, AT&T, and increasingly other entities are building their own fiber lines. For example, some Wall Street investment firms are building fiber, and some platform companies like Facebook and Google are building their own fiber connections so that they are not dependent on other companies to transport their data traffic. Fiber optics is integral to this ecosystem. All of the middle mile and long haul connectivity is provided by fiber optic technology. Some communities have fiber optics all the way to the home. We will compare fiber to other technologies later. On a single strand of fiber, you can carry more information than you can send over the entire spectrum of wireless frequencies. Those fiber strands are then bundled together into fiber optic cables, which can carry dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of strands. There's lots of competing technologies for last mile connections, but for the international long haul and middle mile networks, nothing can beat the speed, efficiency, and durability of fiber.
This slide discusses the three components of the internet: long haul, middle mile, and last mile. A long haul connection might connect the Bay Area to Los Angeles and then down to Mexico. The middle mile connections are more analogous to US highways, connecting communities to one another within a region. Middle mile is a major target for improvement because everyone needs to connect to these lines and wants to be able to do it at convenient locations with reasonable pricing. California is now building a state-owned open access middle mile network to make sure communities that link themselves up will be able to access the wider internet affordably. Last mile is on the right-hand side of this diagram and is exactly what it sounds like. It's often literally the last feet that get you from the shared fiber line to the individual house or business. The last mile is in some ways the most complicated segment because middle mile and long haul networks almost always need the high capacity of fiber. But the last mile can use a greater variety of technologies. Sometimes the last mile uses fiber, sometimes it uses the same cable connections that cable TV uses, and sometimes it's wireless. We need both middle mile and last mile to improve access to the internet in California, to make sure that every community has affordable access to reliable broadband.
What does a fiber optic cable look like? The photo on the left shows a cable which has hundreds of strands of fiber in it. It has an armored cable to protect the fibers inside, and then the individual strands are coming out to the right. The photo on the right is a custom-made high-quality cable used by New York City. Each cable has about 1,400 fiber strands in it, but they also make versions with 7,000 fiber strands. Each of these fiber strands has pretty much, for our purposes, unlimited capacity. Each strand could eventually carry thousands of gigabits or terabits or tens of terabits of data per second. The limit is mostly the electronics at each end, which are capable now of gigabit service. But in the coming years, we'll be able to upgrade the electronics to enable tens of gigabits or hundreds of gigabits or more on that same infrastructure. So this fiber represents a kind of end game for broadband infrastructure. Once fiber is in the ground, it can be upgraded decade after decade just by installing electronics without ever having to dig it up again. This is an extremely important point because we are looking at what's probably a once-in-a-generation opportunity to use state and federal money to deploy broadband infrastructure. So it's important to use something that will solve our broadband needs, not just for the next few years, but for decades into the future. Of course, we know that there are some extremely rural places where fiber may not be the right technology for the last mile. But in almost all cases, including quite rural areas, we are looking at this as an opportunity to invest state and federal money on fiber infrastructure to solve communities' broadband needs for more than a generation.
What are some of the other technologies? This slide lists 5 of them. At the top, dial-up is the oldest technology of the 5, using the copper phone network. In the early days of the internet, you'd hang a modem on your phone, plug it into the telephone line, and it would beep and hum as you communicated over that telephone line. It was very slow, and you paid for the connection by the minute. Video was out of the question, photo would take several minutes to load, and if someone picked up the phone, it could tear down the entire connection. This is what we had before it was clear whether there would be a business case for broadband. The industry that jumped into broadband first was the cable TV industry, because they already had a wire capable of carrying video into many homes. They were able to repurpose that cable connection to carry other data. It was also not shared with the phone line, so it could be on all the time, unlike with dial-up. DSL lines were an evolution of the dial-up technology. DSL uses the same copper wire infrastructure as phone lines and was offered by companies like AT&T, Frontier, etc. And they used electronics to upgrade the speeds from dial-up to be able to provide that same always-on service as cable, just not with the same speeds as cable. Wireless data had a similar slow start. 2G was the first generation to provide more than just voice calls. You could get some data, it was very slow, incapable of images or video. 3G could handle images well enough, but not really two-way video. Now we have 4G and 5G, which are capable of video and use more and more wireless spectrum to provide something approaching wired broadband speeds. The improved cellular technology meets a lot of the needs of broadband, but not at the same speeds or reliability as fiber. Finally, we have fiber to the premises, or fiber to the home, it's also called. This technology was considered very expensive in the early 2000s, but now it's increasingly commonplace because of its durability, speed, and ability to upgrade.
We'll pause here for some questions. How has the internet changed during your career? Do you have fiber here in any neighborhoods? What effects have you seen from introducing fiber? How much of the evolution of communications technology do you remember? Dial-up modems, DSL? What's the cell coverage like in your area? Follow-up questions can always be sent to broadbandcaseworkers@cpuc.ca.gov.
Let's also consider how information moves across the internet. And how is it that we're able to have a video call and carry that information all the way around the world? The internet is as much a system of software and languages as it is of wires and routers and electronics. The first step is that communications like video, voice, letters, etc., are first written out in ones and zeros, then packaged up in what we are calling packets. These packets are analogous to letters or packages being sent by the Postal Service. Each one contains some information as well as instructions for where it needs to go and how it should be unpackaged when it gets there. As a packet moves across the country, computers reroute the packets towards the end destination. When the packets arrive at the final destination, the computer knows how to sort out those different packages and unpackage them to recreate the image or video or sound file or whatever it is that's being sent. That's the basic overview.
This slide illustrates packet routing. How does it look when we are communicating between two places that are quite far apart? Let's say we're at the CPUC's office in San Francisco, and we're on a video call with the FCC in Washington, D.C. The packets will indicate their final destination, Washington, D.C., and each router it hits along the way will know how to send it in the right direction. This may not be in a straight line from source to destination. If the packet starts in San Francisco and then gets to Sacramento, the router will decide whether to send it next to Las Vegas or Portland. And then the next router will send it on again, and again, and again, until it reaches the final destination.
The engines of the internet are routers. Humongous routers sit in major data centers. Data centers are places that require a lot of wiring, power, resilience, and security. The big routers are actually hidden behind the cables in this photo. They're big boxes that are maybe half a rack tall or larger. In the bottom picture, you see a small router that you might use in your home. This connects to your internet service provider, which might be a cable company. This router is quite small and only needs to know about the half dozen or so devices inside your house, but it operates on the same ideas as the larger routers that operate in data centers.
Let's pause again for some questions. What are the equivalent terms for each of the following in the world of physical letters and packages? Is there another metaphor that you would find more helpful? Packets are like, routers are like, the internet protocol is like, and IP addresses are like. Follow-up questions can be sent to broadbandcaseworkers@cpuc.ca.gov.
Four key parameters are used to measure broadband service. Download speed is the speed at which data travels from your provider to you. As you're probably aware, that's often faster than the speed at which information travels from you back to the network. Now that we make more and more video calls, we need to upload live video almost as often as we need to watch it. This symmetrical upload and download is something that fiber is extremely well suited to doing. In wireless, it's more difficult because the cell site is good at sending signals out to you. There's a lot of complexity involved in receiving and processing all of the signals that you and everyone else send back to the cell site. Download and upload speeds are measured in Mbps, megabits per second. Latency is the time it takes for a signal to get from one part of the communications link to another. It's measured in milliseconds. A latency of about 20 milliseconds is what you might have on a cable broadband link between you and a nearby data center. This is 1/50th of a second and mostly not noticeable. For a wireless network with a lot of different users, this latency might rise to 100 milliseconds, which is a little more noticeable. But latency isn't what typically causes lag. What can be more of a problem than just latency is when the amount of latency varies a lot. This is called jitter. Jitter and the corresponding time lags are two things that need to be controlled on a network. They're also two of the things that can go wrong if a network starts to get overwhelmed with too much traffic or data. This is sometimes what happens in real-time applications, such as live video conferencing, because there's so many bits and packets being moved and processed.
One way of testing your network is a speed test. Some of you have probably used these before, but a speed test sends a few packets from your computer to a data center and back again, and measures how long it takes to complete that journey, to calculate the upload and download speeds for your connection. What you see in this illustration is symmetrical speeds of more than 100 megabits per second, which indicates that the user is likely using a very fast wireline connection, such as cable or fiber. This is not a perfect system because a speed test cannot tell you where the problem is if there is a problem. You may not be paying for a fast enough speed, or it may not be possible to get a faster speed in your neighborhood, or your internet connection may be fine, but you may not have a good connection to your own Wi-Fi network. Still, being able to run a speed test can be helpful for the individual, and as we gain more and more speed tests from users in different neighborhoods, we can get a picture of what's realistically available in that neighborhood. If you download CalSpeed, your speed test is used in the California data collection and will show up on the CPUC's interactive map.
Let's talk about how speed and service tiers are priced and sold in the market. For fixed connections, data usage is typically sold with unlimited data at a flat rate with different prices for different speed tiers. When traffic is congested, heavy users may have their usage deprioritized so that everyone can get some service. Mobile service, meanwhile, more frequently pays for a monthly amount of data or a monthly amount of high-speed data, after which the consumer either has to pay more or get substantially slower speeds. Metered service is still used in some telephony services and for international connections. For reference, the average data traffic per household is roughly 600 to 1,000 gigabytes.
Let's pause again for discussion questions on the concepts we just covered. Are upload and download speeds significantly different in your community? Is it a problem for your household? Do you have any questions about bits, bytes, kilo, mega, giga, tera, and storage versus transfer? When do you notice latency or jitter in your connection? And which speed tests have you tried using in your community surveys?
In this next section, we'll cover each of the 5 competing technologies in more detail.
The first
is fiber to the premises, which is fastest and most long-lasting technology available. Fiber to the premises is the most reliable, so-called future-proof, highest capacity connection available, and it has very low maintenance costs. The drawback most commonly noted about fiber is that it does have higher upfront costs. These upfront costs are mostly related to the cost of hanging fiber from utility poles or burying them in trenches. But it can also be the time it takes to deploy fiber due to the greater need to negotiate property rights and acquire permits for wireline connections more than it does for wireless ones. One major advantage of fiber that is talked about less often is that it does not require frequent power connections along the lines to keep them going. Cable, for example, needs power amplifiers every few miles to keep it operating. And if the power goes out, then the battery will last only for a limited amount of time, and then the internet will cut out. This was a problem during some of the California wildfires where communication lines did not necessarily burn up, but because the power went out, the non-fiber communications eventually failed.
Coaxial cable is a bundle of copper wires that were originally designed to deploy cable television, but today it is used to deliver the internet as well. One important point to understand is that cable internet, as provided by a company like Comcast or Charter, uses coaxial cable only for the last quarter mile or so of the connection. The rest of the network uses fiber, which is what makes it possible to deliver speeds of 100 to 1,000 megabits per second. And the trend is for cable companies to add more and more fiber closer and closer to the consumer's home. So this entire technology is converging on fiber to the premises.
This slide illustrates fixed wireless access, which is sometimes called wireless local loop. Fixed wireless is a technology that uses wireless antennas located on high points, such as towers built for that purpose, or grain silos or other available structures, to communicate signals to homes up to a few miles away. The big advantage is that you don't have to lay as many wires. If it isn't realistic to acquire permits and property rights for a wireline connection, it may be possible to use a wireless connection instead. The upfront costs, both in terms of time and money, are usually lower as well. The challenge, as we discussed with fiber, is that fixed wireless requires a lot more maintenance and more frequent upgrades to keep it technologically competitive. Some of the challenges of this technology are that the signal can be blocked by trees or hills or weather conditions. Also, a single tower can only connect to so many households and provide so much speed. So if these parameters are not carefully engineered, then you can have a substandard service. Another challenge is that there's only so much wireless spectrum available in an area. And most of the spectrum that's best for getting around foliage and other obstructions are largely already owned by the major mobile companies. A shared wireless infrastructure can present problems.
Satellite is an interesting technology right now because there's a lot of buzz around Starlink, which is an exciting improvement over geostationary satellites. Starlink and other companies used low Earth orbit satellites. These are essentially a cell tower in the sky that can provide fast connections to extremely rural areas. However, there are some real limits to this technology that we are only just beginning to explore. First is the price. Generally, they are pretty highly priced, and there are limits to how many people can access those satellites. The satellites also need to be replaced every few years, so it is not yet clear whether this business model will prove to be sustainably profitable, considering that those profits have not materialized yet.
Now that we've presented each of the major technologies, how do they compare? This graph shows the speeds that the different technologies are capable of, but it does ignore the other components we discussed, like line of sight, weather effects for fixed wireless. The center of this slide shows throughput from lowest at kilobits per second to gigabits per second on the right. This is not a linear graph. The jumps are orders of magnitude higher. If you are considering a wireless technology, you'll need to look more closely at a lot of other factors, such as number of users, weather, topography, and spectrum availability. But this graph at least shows the realistic ranges for the different technologies.
How much speed do end users require? This is a very important question. For those speeds to mean anything, it's helpful to consider how much data is required for different users of the internet. Two slides follow, one for current needs and one for needs in the near future.
This table shows realistic data needs for a family of 4 with fairly basic data needs. Right now, if you add up these uses with maybe one adult working remotely and one child studying remotely during the day, the family streaming videos at night, you end up needing about 40 megabits per second downlink at the home. However, a lot of families find that they need a lot more than that, and that wherever you want to draw the line for minimum speeds, those expectations for speed and throughput will continue to rise over time. I find this chart with a 40 megabit uplink speed to be unrealistic for real-time applications like video.
This future needs chart looks a lot like my neighbor's, but we'll call them future for the purposes of this discussion. You can see a lot of augmented reality here, more gaming, which requires a lot more uplink speed than you would expect since it looks like real-time video. Would anyone like to comment on their highest bandwidth home use application?
Here are some discussion questions for this section. What new factoid did you learn during this session? What part of this technology overview do you want to know more about? What areas do you want to explore? Who configures your home wireless router? Do they get special treats?
Thank you for joining us for the CPUC's Technology of Broadband Level 1 webinar. This slide shows you some of the topics you can look forward to in the future broadband technology webinars covering network design and construction. If there are other topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars, or if you would like to speak to us about scheduling an in-person seminar on these topics for your county or tribal government, please contact us at broadbandcaseworkers@cpuc.ca.gov.